All right, Dr. Lemke, thank you so much for joining me here on the show today. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so we're gonna dig into some really interesting topics, but before we do that, I have to ask you the question that I have asked almost like 300 people now on the show, which is, tell us a story about a defining moment in your life that has made you who you are today.
I would say the single most defining moment in my life was the death of our first child to leukemia and
Hmm.
the birth of our four subsequent children.
Hmm. Yeah, that I can not imagine that. How long ago was that?
Oh gosh, our son would have been 21 this year.
Wow. How obviously I don't want to go too far into that, but how did you manage to navigate something like that and still carry through? Because I would imagine you had your career happening at that time, and I think for some people who have experienced that type of loss and grief, or are in the throes of that right now, it's sometimes helpful to hear other people's experience. And so if you have any words of wisdom for the people out there, what would you leave them with?
To answer that question, I couldn't even answer it in a single sound bite.
That's an episode.
Yeah, it's my next book actually.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, well, I welcome you back onto the show for that one. We'll carry
Great.
that conversation on
Thank
next
you.
time. So you wrote this incredible book called Dopamine Nation, and you've got some really powerful insight in it. And at the very beginning, you open with this story about this man who I was just captivated by. Like I don't think I've read a book in a long time where the initial story just catches me in a way where I'm like, oh, you got me. Like you activated my dopamine. Good
Right.
job.
I
Good
know.
good job. But in many ways, the book is about this dynamic between pleasure and pain, and and our relationship with this sort of chemical inside of us, dopamine. So, what was the spur for you? Like, what pushed you and propelled you to want to write this book? Just out of curiosity.
I wrote this book with a genuine desire to want to help other people. I have learned a ton from my patients. They are modern day heroes and modern day prophets, and I feel like their wisdom is something that other people would benefit from.
Hmm. Beautiful. Yeah. Thank you. So when it comes to something like addiction, there's many different forms of how we define that. There's many different forms of how we look at something like addiction, whether it's substance, whether it's social media, whether it's pornography. We have a lot of men that come into our space that are struggling with exactly that, with porn addictions of various forms. And I'm curious to get your take on how you define pornography, and is there sorry, how you define addiction, and is there a difference necessarily between something like substance abuse or social media or porn or sex addiction when it comes to what's happening neurologically or within the body?
Yeah, so there are lots of different definitions of addiction, but they all come down to basically the same thing, which is the continued compulsive use of a substance or behavior despite harm to self and or others. A shorthand way to remember the DSM criteria for that is the three C's: control, compulsion, and consequences.
Hmm.
Another definition of addiction that I like, though that's a little unorthodox but is relevant for the book, is addiction is the things we do that we lie about.
Hmm. Uh-huh. Okay. Can you say more about that? I feel like that, like I can almost like hear my audience being like, "Oof." It's one of those oof moments. Uh-huh. Yeah, the things we
Yeah,
lie about. Yeah.
yeah. Well, I mean, one of the cardinal features of addiction is this, what we call the double life, where we're living our regular lives, but then on the side, we have this other life that is not known to the important people in our lives. And on
Hmm.
some level, even hidden from ourselves through this process we call denial, which one of my patients said is an acronym that stands for Don't Even Know I Am Lying.
Hmm.
And I love that because it really does represent the ways in which we can have this divided brain where we're living out certain behaviors, but not even acknowledging to ourselves that they're happening. They're in this kind of dream, like waking dream-like place in our minds.
And is there some sort of advantage to that kind of behavior? Is there like an evolutionary advantage to that? Is there a biochemical benefit to that? Because it seems like that's such a prevalent thing that has emerged within our species.
Our brains have evolved over millions of years to approach pleasurable stimuli and avoid painful ones. And it's what's kept us alive in a world of scarcity and ever present danger. So it makes a lot of sense that we would be wired this way. The problem is that we've now created a world of overwhelming abundance. So what was once an adaptive mechanism has become our Achilles heel.
Hmm.
I would say also that, in my opinion, people with severe addiction are people who, in another time and place, would have been the most adapted among us because they would have been the ones willing to search longer and further to find that oasis in the desert. But
Hmm.
now those individuals may be the most vulnerable in our modern society because of their predilection for addiction to these intoxicating stimuli.
Yeah, interesting. And so in many ways, the mechanism has always been there. However, the environment that we found ourselves in has altered and changed to such a degree where uh, it's maybe not as useful as it used to be.
That's
Right.
right. Dopamine Nation is essentially the story of how our primitive brains are not made for our modern environment.
Interesting. Okay. And yeah, and you talk a lot about this dichotomy between the pursuit of pleasure and the active avoidance of pain and the relationship between the two. Can you just say a little bit more, and maybe we can start to go into this, but can you say a little bit of what's actually happening in the brain when we're pursuing pleasure and trying to avoid pain? Because those are two sort of different systems that are at play, if my understanding is correct.
Yeah, so one of the most interesting discoveries in the field of neuroscience in the last 75 years is that pleasure and pain are co located. And by that, I mean that they are processed in the same parts of the brain and they work like opposite sides of a balance. So when we do something pleasurable, our balance tips slightly to the side of pleasure. We get a little release of dopamine, our reward neurotransmitter in the brain, and we feel good. But the way one of the overarching rules governing that balance is that it wants to remain level. It doesn't want to be tipped to pleasure or pain for very long.
Hmm.
So, no sooner has that happened than our brains will downregulate our own dopamine transmission and our own dopamine production in order to level the balance again. But the brain intentionally overshoots that in order to restore a level balance, or what's called homeostasis. And I imagine that as these little neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again. But the thing is, the gremlins like it on the balance, so they stay until it's tipped an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. And that's the come down or the after effect or the hangover. Now, if we wait long enough, the gremlins hop off, that feeling passes, and a level balance or homeostasis is restored. But if we repeat that behavior again and again, we eventually end up with so many gremlins on the pain side of the balance that they fill this whole room. We change our set point and we essentially end up with a balance chronically tilted to the side of pain. That means we have to continue to use our drug just to feel normal. And when we're not using it, we're in a state of withdrawal, craving, irritability, depression, anxiety, and nothing else is enjoyable.
Hmm. Yeah, interesting. And so I'm curious to get your take on. There's many different perspectives on how addictions are formed, and what I hear you saying is that in some ways it is really spurred out of this pursuit of more pleasure where we can become sort of hooked or have an addictive behavior form, or the avoidance of some form of pain that manifests that can create the addiction. And I think when people think of addiction, they see or think of the normal sort of causes, right? That somebody experienced some form of traumatic or adverse event, and it created something that people needed to subside the pain from, or avoid, or escape, or numb, or deal with. And that's how the addiction manifested. I'm curious, from your perspective, is there always a causality? Because I think I've seen addicts that, whether it's porn or sex or drugs, or even things like social media, where they don't think that there is any form of cause, that there's nothing that sort of transpired before that sort of can be labeled as the reason why they're an addict.
Yeah, so this is a really important question because um, it is true that trauma or co-occurring mental illness or other experiences can drive us toward using substances, and so in some ways be responsible for the creation of our addiction. But it's also true that we can have the perfect life and still get addicted, that there
Mm.
can in fact be nothing behind the addiction except for the addiction itself. And I would also emphasize that sometimes spending too much time trying to figure out why we're addicted is not a worthwhile endeavor. Because even when we discover what that underlying reason may be, once we become addicted, it's a very physiologic, biological phenomenon. And what we need to do is engage in behaviors to get well from that addiction. So, although I certainly acknowledge the role of trauma, for example, in the possible etiology of addiction in some cases, I think that the role of trauma can be overstated, and that on some level, people need to realize that addiction can just be caused by being exposed and having access to highly addictive stimuli. And I emphasize again and again that in our modern world, it is the increased access, the almost ubiquitous access to these drugified experiences and substances that makes us all vulnerable to addiction.
Yeah, I remember a couple years ago speaking at an all boys school. It was like this Catholic college prep military school, all boys school. It was like 650 boys, and I was doing some research leading up into this, of talking to the boys, because they wanted me to come in and talk about masculinity, and they wanted me to address porn. And I was like, wow, that's really offloading some responsibility onto me,
Yeah,
right?
wow. I'm
and
impressed.
uh but anyway, in my research, I found that a lot of young boys, a lot of young men are coming into finding pornographic materials between the age of 8 and 11 now. And I thought to myself, what a challenging thing to find at that age. Especially if you've never had anyone talk to you about sex, talk to you about what's happening in the body, none of those things. And so in the school, I just did an exercise. I had a couple slides, and at one point, this slide, went, the screen that was up there, it said porn on the background. And all the boys, 650 boys, and they are still, kind of making noise and wrestling around. And I said, okay, the teachers are all going to turn their back. And so all the teachers were in the rafters, and I said, all the teachers turn your back, and the parents turn your backs. And so they all turned their backs and turned around. And I said, all right, guys, raise your hands if you've watched porn. And these guys were from, these boys were from grade 4 all the way up to grade 12. And I would say probably about 95% of those boys put their hands up. And
Yeah.
I was shocked. I was really
Mhm.
shocked. So later on that night, I had a conversation with the parents of not all the boys, but whoever wanted to show up. And we talked about engaging that conversation. Um, so I think what you're saying is right, is that we have access to things that we've never had to experience before.
Right.
Things like social media that are literally designed to try and capture our attention. And I
Yeah.
don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but I can't seem to help myself but ask, like, how do we begin to regulate our systems, our brains, our nervous systems, in a world that is designed to hook us in some ways. So I don't necessarily think that we need to talk about strategies specifically, but if you want to just speak to that briefly before we go back into what we were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the very premise of Dopamine Nation, that acknowledging that we are living in this drugified world with 24/7 access to these highly reinforcing substances and behaviors, that children from a very young age have access to drugs that would have been unimaginable even a generation ago, and that we have to take on this very real conversation about what this means about our development, our behavior, our values. How are we going to navigate this really unprecedented time in human history?
Mm. So I guess to better understand this, so that we can have a better conversation around, this the drugified, whether that's social media or things like pornography and what's happening. Can you just give us a bit of a basic understanding of the neurochemistry of addiction and what's actually taking place within us when we are experiencing an addictive behavior?
Sure. So basically, the slide into addiction is when our pleasure pain balance gets weighted to the side of pain, such that we then have compulsive urges to repeat the behavior, not just to get pleasure, but merely to regain homeostasis. So I think that that's the key piece. We start out using for fun or to solve a problem, but we get to a point where we're using because we're using, right? We get caught up in that vicious cycle of not being able to put it away because our physiology has adapted to its constant presence. And for people who have no personal or family exposure or experience to addiction, I often suggest the experiment of just putting your smartphone away for 24 hours, and if you're willing and able to do that, noticing how preoccupied you are, especially in the first 12 hours, thinking about where your phone is, who might have contacted you, what you might be missing, why it's so important to not do the experiment and instead check the phone again, because it doesn't really matter doing the experiment. It wasn't really that important to you in the first place. Or a million other reasons that you justify to yourself why it makes sense to go grab your phone. And to do that experiment is really to get a little bit of a window in what it's like for people who become addicted, obviously to a much greater degree with much more significant consequences. And again, physiologically, what's happening is we've basically overloaded our reward pathway with dopamine such that the brain has to adapt. By downregulating our own dopamine production, we enter a dopamine deficit state. And it is that dopamine deficit state that drives us to seek out our drug, again, in order just to restore homeostasis, not even to feel good, but to stop feeling bad.
Hmm. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. So, how does that differ from what's happening in, let's just say, like a withdrawal state, like when you're going through withdrawal from your social media usage or from your drug of choice? How is that different from what you just described, or is that a similar mechanism?
It's the exact same mechanism, but it can be much more subtle and much more protracted. So acute physical withdrawal tends to last days. This is a phenomenon that can really last weeks or months, or in some cases of severe addiction, even years, just because it requires a lot of work on the part of the brain to restore baseline dopamine levels. And this is what we talk about with the protracted abstinence syndrome. Why it's often very puzzling when we see people with severe addiction who get into recovery, whose lives are going so much better, and then who seem to relapse out of the blue.
Hmm.
And to understand what's going on there it's really necessary to appreciate that those folks are not walking around with a level balance, right? They're walking around with a balance that's chronically tilted to the side of pain. They're in a dopamine deficit state. And so everything is exertion for them. And they're sort of bombarded with these constant intrusive thoughts of wanting to use. And it's not that they're indulging themselves when they relapse, it's that they're finally giving in to just a relentless onslaught of cravings and physiologic urges to
Hmm.
use.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you have a beautiful amount of empathy for people that are experiencing this. What's it like for you to walk around in our world and see the world that we live in, see the modern Western culture that we live in through your lens, having been somebody that has researched this and worked with addiction so much and knows so much about it? Like what's your experience with that?
Well, I think my main experience is wanting people to understand where the relentless pursuit of pleasure and comfort leads, so that they can, in understanding the neuroscience, really reframe their own goals and experiences, reconceptualize why they might be depressed and anxious, and reconsider some of their coping strategies, which typically lean toward trying to increase comfort, when in
Mm.
fact doing that may be the very wrong thing for how to feel better. I will also add that as a parent of teenagers, I'm worried for my kids growing up in this world. My kids are exposed to things that I hadn't even heard of until I was an adult, and I'm both curious and worried to see what they're going to do with all of that access and all of that information. It certainly is a very strange time to be growing up.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, we seem to be living through, I mean, a tremendous amount of fear, and I think not only just fear, but there's this kind of confusion that seems to be prominent within our culture that's disorienting for a lot of people. And I think that when people are disoriented, they need some form of certainty. And I think that's where, in some ways, I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, where addictive behavior sets in, because the more disorientation they have, the less certainty that we have. At least when I think about my own addictive behaviors that I've had in the past. I mean, I certainly had a problem. I've talked about this on the show before, but I've certainly had a problem with pornography in my early 20s, where it was hours at a time, sometimes 4, 5, 6 hours at a time. And it was probably the worst in my life when I had the least amount of certainty. It was this really, it really took hold where I was very unsure about relationship, career, and was very afraid of what was happening in my life, and that's when it took hold the strongest. And so I'm curious to get your perspective of, when we are disoriented, when we are confused, when we lack certainty in some areas of our life, is it easier to move into this addictive behavior and to have this dopamine withdrawal that you're talking about present, or am I missing the mark there?
I mean, no, you're definitely not missing the mark, especially since your own experience was that your pornography use was greatest in a time of more uncertainty. So clearly, in your experience, those things are related. I guess the way that I look at it, though, is that I mean, life is always uncertain. I mean, I think probably one of the scariest things about being alive is the ways in which we have no idea what's coming next.
Hmm.
I mean, I must say, I mean, I deal with that. I feel that I deal with that fear constantly. Um, and I think that, as a defense against that uncertainty and our not knowing, we can resort to all kinds of different defense mechanisms to cope with that, and many of them maladaptive. And of course, sort of hiding in our addictions is one way to do that. But there are other ways as well, that people sort of manage to try to. I would say they try to pretend like life is more certain than it is, or to run away from their awareness of how little control we actually have over our lives.
Hmm.
One of the important aspects of recovery from addiction turns out to be um, the ability to let go and to realize that we really don't control a whole lot of stuff that happens to us, and that the efforts to try to control the way we feel or what's going to happen next or what other people are doing, are they're really just it's sort of a mirage. It's a way that we pretend we have a control or convince ourselves that we have control. It's really when we embrace how little control we have over our lives that we're able to give up these maladaptive defense mechanisms like addiction and move into recovery. I don't know if that answered your question, but I hope so.
No, yeah, no. That's wonderful. I mean, I usually say that when I found for myself, and I've found that a lot of people have resonated this, that when I feel the need to be in control, I'm often out of power.
That's
You
right.
know, I'm often out of power, and it's because I'm grasping. Alan Watts had this great saying, the four words that kind of changed my life. He said, "Belief clings and faith allows."
That's right.
And I love that idea because I think in many ways, when we are seeking control, we're seeking to believe in something, and we need to grasp. You know, we have to hold on because we don't like the idea that we might not be standing on solid ground. And so,
Yeah.
do you feel as though everyone is susceptible, and sort of yeah? Do you feel like everyone is susceptible to some form of addiction, or can it show up in anyone's life?
I used to think that I wasn't susceptible to addiction. I used to think that I had a relative immunity to it. Now, I come from a family of people with addiction. My father had an alcohol problem. His brother died of alcoholism, but alcohol never did anything for me except make me sleepy. Other drugs, although I've tried a limited repertoire, really didn't have any effect, and I wasn't particularly drug curious.
Hmm.
But what I talk about in the book and what I realized is I really just hadn't yet met my drug of choice. And it wasn't until, oddly, in middle age, I discovered romance novels and then ultimately progressed to erotica that I realized, oh, wow, I think I'm getting a little bit of an addiction here.
Hmm.
And that really made me realize, we're living in a time when we're all vulnerable. There are so many new drugs out there, drugs that never existed before, new variants of old drugs. And once we find that key that fits into that lock and turns it, there's something, I'm convinced there's something for all of us now out
Hmm.
there, which really changes the landscape and which really was one of the driving forces behind my writing Dopamine Nation, this idea that we're all vulnerable to addiction and we all need the wisdom of recovery, even if we have sort of minor, quirky, or somewhat laughable addictions that we can joke about. The same, it's the same phenomenon, and the potential impact is real.
Hmm. And when you use the word drugs, I'm assuming that you're not just talking about substance. Like I would imagine that you're using a much broader context for that. So can you just contextualize that for myself and the listeners?
Sure. So when I'm talking about drugs, I'm really talking about anything that releases a lot of dopamine in the brain's reward pathway. The fundamental difference between something that is potentially addictive and something that isn't is that addictive things release a lot more dopamine. So that would include not just traditional drugs like cocaine and heroin and cannabis and Xanax, but would also include pornography, gambling, shopping, romance novels, video games, you name it, all of it.
Yeah, the video games are a big one. I heard a stat that there's this one game, I think it's League of Legends, and there's a tournament that happens, and more people watch the final of that tournament than watch the Super Bowl. And that blew me away. I was like, what? Like,
Yeah.
like if video games have gotten that popular, okay, like
Or
that's
it's a
not what
whole
that
new
looked like.
era.
Yeah,
That's
it's a
right.
whole new area. Now people are watching other people play online.
Yeah.
So it's a whole different ball game. But when it comes to your methodology of working with people, and whether wherever they fall on the spectrum uh, of their relationship to these habits, right, these dopamine habits, and pursuing pleasure, and trying to avoid pain, where do you begin? How do you begin to work with someone that says, I think I might have a bit of a problem? Where does that work start for you?
Well, I kind of have a framework that I use. I've developed this acronym dopamine to describe it. And I kind of go through that. And it's what I also teach my residents and fellows and medical students. So I start just by gathering data about what they're using, how much, how often. I mean, that's the D of dopamine, stands for data. And that's important because when people say out loud how much they're using and in what way, it often brings it into relief and makes it real in a way that it's
Mm.
not when it's just a behavior that is unvoiced. Then I ask them why they use, because people have good reasons or they wouldn't do it. And that's the O for objectives. What are their objectives for using? And then the P stands for problems. What are the problems associated with use? So it's important always when dealing with addiction to acknowledge both sides, both what's good about the use and what's not working out so well. And then the A of dopamine stands for abstinence. And that's my early and first intervention when I ask patients to engage in an experiment with me and to essentially do a dopamine fast where they stop using their drug of choice for a period of time, typically a month. And the reason I ask for a month is because that's the minimum amount of time, in my experience, patients need in order to reset their reward thresholds, in
Mm.
order for those gremlins to hop off the pain side of the balance and for homeostasis to be restored. And when I ask them to do that, obviously I don't ask patients who might experience life threatening withdrawal to do that. But for those who will not have a serious physical life threatening withdrawal and who can stop, I ask them to notice how in the first couple of weeks they'll feel worse. That's because without using, their balance and all those gremlins will tip to the side of pain. They'll experience the universal symptoms of withdrawal, anxiety, irritability, insomnia, dysphoria, craving. But if they just keep going, it's time limited. The gremlins will hop off. They'll start to regenerate their own dopamine. And if they can get to a month, I would say about 80% of patients come back in feeling a lot better. Anxiety is better. Depression is better. They feel physically restored. And that's almost universally for whatever the drug is. So if it's a sex addiction, I ask for no orgasms with themselves or others for that time period. If it's cannabis, then it's no cannabis. So whatever the drug is, ask them to avoid that drug or that subcategory within the larger group. And then, the M of the dopamine acronym stands for mindfulness. That's where they learn to observe their raw and hard emotions, but not try to do anything to change the way they feel. And that's super counterculture because, of course, we're trained to run from feeling bad or to take something or to do something. Instead, I say, no, you just sit with it. It's really hard, but just tolerate it because what you'll notice then is it does pass, right? It seems like it never will in the moment, but if you just wait, it will pass over like a wave. And then the I of dopamine stands for insight. And this is a key piece of it, that when we are in our addiction, we often cannot clearly see cause and effect. We
Mm.
don't see how our drug use impacts our life. But when we get some time away from it and we look back, we're able to see more clearly how our use really is impacting our lives, impacting our relationships, contrary to our values. So that's the insight of the dopamine acronym. And then when people come back, I ask them the pros and cons of using or not using. And then the N stands for next steps and the E stands for experiment. That's where we talk about, okay, if you're going to go back to using and want to use in more moderation, which is usually what people want to do, then what is that going to look like? How often will you use? How much will you use? What are the conditions of use? What are some self-binding strategies that you can implement to protect yourself against slipping back into immoderate or unhealthy use? And so that's
Mm.
generally the approach.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for that. I appreciate you laying that out. I feel like that's it's a very like robust system that I feel like people can hear and begin to maybe implement. Do you have, I'm just curious on that note, do you have resources on your site or through your work that walk people through that dopamine acronym?
Well, I mean, it's clearly laid out in the book, so
Yeah,
that's
good.
really the major resource. I'm not on social media and I don't have a big, so I don't have, like a presence in that way, but
It's okay.
the book lays it all out.
It's perfect. I'm curious. You mentioned weed there before, and I think there's there's some research that's starting to surface around things like ayahuasca and psilocybin and MDMA as being viable treatments towards things like severe depression, and in some cases, supporting with addiction. I'm curious to get your personal take on that. Maybe not from like a professional standpoint, but a personal standpoint, indeed, to see, do you feel like, do you feel like the research is starting to show that things like psilocybin are supportive for supporting people with things like with certain addictions?
Yeah, so this is a tough question to answer because the research truly is very preliminary and is highly dependent on the selection of
Mm,
appropriate patients. And my concern with these agents is that if actually deployed, in the general public as a treatment, that the very stringent self-selecting process to make sure that the people who undergo the treatment are the people who could really benefit from it will be almost impossible to implement. And that instead you'll have a self-selecting group who want to do that kind of treatment, who also are potentially most vulnerable to the harms of that kind of treatment. So it's
mm,
not that I'm saying it would never work. I believe that it probably could be helpful for a small minority of individuals, but I don't know if the potential benefits outweigh the potential harms. And with any medical treatment, that's always the question that we need to ask. Not does the treatment work for a given individual, but on an individual and a population level, do the benefits outweigh the harms? And we're certainly very far from knowing whether or not that is the case. I
mm,
would also add that I am generally skeptical of a, simple solution to a complicated problem.
mm,
Addiction is definitely a complicated problem, and it's a chronic relapsing and remitting problem, which is probably going to need a chronic relapsing and remitting intervention, not a one time or two time or even three time psychotherapy assisted psilocybin experience.
mm.
So, I guess to sum up my viewpoint, I'm skeptical but trying to be open.
Right. Yeah, that's fair. I appreciate that. I appreciate that. I couldn't help but get into that question. Uh, how do we begin to, I think about the people listening to this interview and listening to what you're saying, and maybe identifying as someone who overuses social media. I mean, I just love that we have terminology for this, right? Like doom scrolling, right? That we catch
Right.
ourselves just sort of constantly, and we know that we're caught. We know that
Mhm.
we're caught in the hamster wheel. How do we begin to redirect or channel or utilize that energy in a different way, in a different direction? And I know you've laid out the dopamine acronym and some of those pieces, but I'm curious for people that maybe aren't uh, dealing with a substance abuse issue, but clearly can't seem to get off of Instagram. What would you say? Would you say that dopamine fasting is the best place to start? Is giving it up for 30 days the best place to begin, and setting some very like stringent rules around that, or what would you say?
Yeah. So I think Instagram and other social media apps, um, really the same rules apply. And I think a good first pass intervention is the dopamine framework and a dopamine fast. Now, if 4 weeks is not possible, then do it for a week. Even a single day is challenging for many of us. But that is truly what I would recommend because it's important to have that initial break in order to restore the balance and reset reward pathways. And it's much easier to go from a level balance into moderation than to go from overuse to dialing it back. It's just
Hmm.
much harder to do that. The other thing that I would just emphasize is that social media is tapping into our fundamental desire for human connection, which is at its face a very adaptive urge, and also makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, right? So we are social creatures. When we come together in groups, we're more likely to find mates. We're more likely to be able to protect ourselves from predators. We can come together to better utilize scarce resources. So there are all kinds of reasons that we come together. And we do know that oxytocin, the love hormone that's secreted when we make intimate bonds, directly stimulates dopamine neurons to release dopamine in the reward pathway. So it's
Hmm.
all tied in together. And this desire for connection is human and good. What's happened, or what can happen with social media, is that it can become drugified, where all of a sudden the complexity of human interactions and the effortfulness of human interactions is taken away, and all we need is a one tap and a swipe, and we have access to a million beautiful faces. So that's why I think it's important to take a break and then go back with kind of renewed um, goals and motivation to use it differently and in a healthy and adaptive way, however the person defines that.
Hmm. Yeah, well said. Thank you for that. I mean, it seems like, as you were speaking, I couldn't help but think that part of, as you were speaking there, that part of the polarization that we're experiencing is a byproduct of exactly what you're talking about, that we want to pursue feeling good. And so we move into spaces where there's no disagreement,
Right.
where our opinion can be validated, where we can feel good about our belief system and what we're saying, and other people will reinforce that. And suddenly we find ourselves in a space where there's not only maybe a couple people, but hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of people who are wanting to do that. And it almost sounds like what you're saying is that to extract ourselves from that is to have to learn or retrain ourselves how to regulate our system, how
Right.
to regulate our nervous
Mhm.
system and to move out of that fight, flight, or freeze response mechanism and into a more down-regulated homeostasis. So, are there certain practices that you have or that you recommend for clients on a daily basis to manage their nervous system and manage this dopamine system that that seems to drive us up the wall, but also drive our behavior in so many ways?
Yeah. So, in addition to just broadly trying to avoid highly dopaminergic substances and behaviors that tilt our pleasure pain balance too far to the side of pleasure, I also recommend intentionally seeking out painful and uncomfortable activities,
Hmm.
because by gently pressing on the pain side of the balance, we can get those neuroadaptation gremlins to hop on the pleasure side and, in fact, try to reset our pleasure pain pathways to the side of pleasure. And we see this again and again. It's related to the science of hormesis, where, for example, exercising, vigorous exercise, although in the moment painful, as an after effect releases large amounts of dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, and other feel good chemicals, which endure far beyond the activity itself. I also talk about things like cold water immersion, or even more subtle forms of pain. Just, for example, engaging in an intellectually challenging activity without letting ourselves interrupt ourselves by checking our phones. So, putting the phones away and tolerating the frustration that comes when we get to a hard spot in our thinking, and not letting ourselves distract ourselves by doing something else in that moment. Doing creative things where the outcome is uncertain. And again, learning to deal with that frustration, developing frustration tolerance in the
Hmm.
moment. This is all about building up those mental calluses. For patients, for example, who come in describing social anxiety, I will recommend exposure therapy, and that's graded exposure to the thing that makes them anxious. And over time, what they find is that they're not only able to do that thing that gave them anxiety, but they can even start to enjoy it. So it's all about resetting the nervous system, as you say, resetting those reward pathways in a healthy and adaptive way, and making that part of our daily schedule.
Yeah, well said. Thank you for that. I love that. Yeah, I think you said mental callousness, like to just be able to like harden that part of ourselves. It's
Right.
so well articulated. I mean, I am reading The Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt right now, and
Yes.
I mean, he's talking about this in depth, and a lot of the research that they've come out with, and that he references in other books around the impact of social media, especially on young teenage girls, and depression rates and the anxiety rates and the suicide rates within the younger generation is dramatic. It's really dramatic. I mean, I cannot fathom or imagine having to be a teenager. I look back on my life and I'm like, man, I don't know how I would have fared. Like, truly, I do not know how I would have fared through that. I don't. I can't imagine it having gone very well. Knowing how I felt and knowing what I was experiencing, and
Yeah.
et cetera. And so,
Hmm.
what do you say to parents, who come to you and are concerned about the impact? We're talking about this dopamine system and social media and these sort of virtual drugs that we can all consume now. What would you say to the parents that are listening to this and are wanting to support their children in a more effective manner? Should we regulate time with social media, or how do they speak to their kids about these very addictive substances that are now normal?
The first thing I say is that they should be modeling the behavior that they want to see in their own children.
I'm
Often
sure
I
that goes over well. Yeah.
Yeah, right, exactly. So, parents come in, my kid's on his phone all the time, and then you find out that the parent's on the phone in equal or amount or more.
Right.
So, making it a family activity, and then just talking about it, openly acknowledging the problem. I really emphasize educating kids about the neuroscience, getting them to reflect on how they feel when they're on their phones or playing video games versus how they feel when they get off,
Mm,
and noticing that drop off and the dopamine deficit state that follows the engagement with screens and with their devices. And then to have them reflect on how that fall off that occurs right after they disengage might actually have persistent and lingering effects, and be part of what's contributing toward them not being able to feel good about themselves or enjoy their lives, or might be contributing to clinical depression and anxiety. And then, yeah, especially parents of young children, I really recommend not giving kids access to screens at all unless in a highly supervised setting for short amounts of time. So, for kids younger than 13, maybe no more than 1 to 2 hours a week, honestly, and
mm,
having the family do that time on the screen together. Once kids get to be teenagers and they're off, in middle school and high school, all bets are off. All the kids have phones now. Even if your kid doesn't have a phone, they'll watch somebody else's phone. My younger son certainly saw pornography around age 8 or 9, because he saw it on his friend's phone, and while his
mm,
friend was looking at it, and I have no control over that. So our control is limited at best as parents, but what control we have, we should exert to protect our children and their young minds from really the quagmire that is the internet. And then once they do have access, having a lot of open discussions with them about their use, about safe use, about what drugs look like, because drugs are different than they used to be. They're harder, they come in many different forms. And
mm.
just really raising kids' awareness, giving them information so that they can make the best choices possible in a really challenging and unprecedented circumstance.
Well, this conversation has felt like a breath of fresh air, and so I appreciate everything that you've had to say. And I think just on that last point, my wife and I have a 5.5-month-old son. We just
Nice.
son, and
Congratulations.
thank you. Yeah, and we've started to have these conversations already. About
Mhm.
screen time, about social media. About how we talk to him about drugs.
Yeah.
And what that means and what that term means and what it includes. And and I really appreciate your insight. I feel like you have, for me personally, in some way, better equipped me to have that conversation and to look at that perspective. And so, thank you for your work and for this conversation. Your book is out now, so people can go and check that out, Dopamine Nation. Any final words that you want to leave people with? I just want to give you the opportunity to say anything that maybe we didn't touch on or cover that's within the book that you feel like is vital.
No, I think you did a great job covering it. Congratulations on your new parenthood. I will say that being a parent has been by far the most joyous and rewarding thing that I have ever done. And I'm always delighted when I hear that people choose parenthood.
Mm.
And I think that you're right. You and your wife are absolutely right to think about having these conversations early, to make them very open and transparent. I love how you were transparent here on the podcast about your own pornography problems. And, at the right age that you will decide, I would also be transparent with your child about that.
Mm. Beautiful. Well said. Thank you so much. We will have the link for your work, for your book, Dopamine Nation, in the show notes. For everyone that's out there listening, don't forget to share this episode with somebody that you know will benefit from it, whether they are a parent, whether they're an individual that has gone through addiction themselves, whether they have somebody in their family that's navigating through this question, or they just want to learn more about our dopamine system. So don't forget to leave us a rating and review. And until next week, this is Connor Beaton signing off.